There is no doubt that the decision to invade and occupy Iraq in March 2003 was an act of military aggression launched on a false pretext, as the inquiry accepts. On February the 15th, 2003, along with 1.5 million people spanning the entire political spectrum in Britain and tens of millions of others across the world, many of us marched against the impending war.
Thank you to every single person that's here today in the biggest ever political demonstration in the history of this country. Every country, every continent, everybody in the world has a chance today to say no, absolutely no, to war on Iraq. Why are we spending £3.5 billion on a war that nobody wants? Thousands more deaths in Iraq will not make things right. It will set off a spiral of conflict, of hate, of misery, of desperation that will fuel the wars, the conflict, the terrorism, the depression and the misery of future generations. We want to live in a world free from war. This movement is giving that message to the British government. Stop now or pay a political price. Thank you very much.
And then it became abundantly clear that weapons of mass destruction did not exist, and that Tony Blair had misled Parliament, he'd misled you and I, the British public, but worst of all, he'd misled those brave young men that were going out to Iraq to lay down their lives for his war.
Fighting this campaign has not been an easy task for me, but I had to do it for my son, Thomas Keyes, Royal Military Policeman, killed in Iraq 4 days short of his 21st birthday. Sent to war under extremely controversial circumstances. Extremely controversial circumstances. Tonight there are lessons to be learned. And I hope in my heart that one day the Prime Minister may be able to say sorry.
So I now apologise sincerely on behalf of my party for the disastrous decision to go to war in Iraq. The apology is owed first to all the people of Iraq. Hundreds of thousands of lives have been lost, and the country is still living with the devastating consequence of the war and the forces it unleashed. They have paid the greatest price for the most serious foreign policy calamity of the last 60 years. The apology is also owed to the families of those soldiers who died in Iraq or have returned home injured and incapacitated. They did their duty, but it was in a conflict they should never have been sent to.
Corbyn is the antithesis of Blair because he says what he thinks and he doesn't filter it through some sort of mental PR filter. Do you know what I mean? Whatever you think of his policies, he's not thinking about what will win votes. He just says what he thinks, unless he's talking about the EU. But that's another time, Tim.
Mr. Corbyn is still the front runner in this leadership contest. The question is, as further allegations emerge, how long can he remain out front?
He's no Mick Jagger, but when Labour opposition leader Jeremy Corbyn appeared at the famous Glastonbury Music Festival in southwest England, he received a rock star's welcome.
But let's also look at instability and problems around the world and tackle the causes of war. Let's look to build a world of human rights, peace, justice and democracy. Peace is possible.
Many experts, including professionals in our intelligence and security services, have pointed out the connections between wars that we've been involved in or supported and fought in other countries, such as Libya, and terrorism here at home. So I would like to take a moment to speak to our soldiers on the streets of Britain. You're doing your duty, as you have done so many times before. I want to assure you that under my leadership you will only be deployed abroad when there is a clear need and only when there is a plan that you have the resources to do your job and secure an outcome that delivers lasting peace.
Earlier in the day, the head of the armed forces was asked about Jeremy Corbyn's stated objection to ever using a nuclear weapon.
It would worry me if that thought was translated into power, as it were, because...
So if he wins, he's a problem?
Well, there's a couple of hurdles to cross before we get to that.
The armed forces obviously must advise, obviously must put their point of view, obviously have a great deal of access to the Secretary of State for Defence, the Prime Minister, and of course every other MP and opposition members. I do not think it's helpful if they start making political comments of a partisan and party political nature.
The day started with the usual anti-Corbyn suspects latching on to what they considered a half-hearted bow at Whitehall. If defence was their Achilles heel, critics will today trumpet full Greek tragedy.
I don't believe that we should force anyone to participate in anything that they don't believe in. He respectfully, he respected the tradition and he stood up and he was a part of the ceremony, but I don't think that he should be forced to participate. At the end of the day, we should be more tolerant of different people's points of view, and also many of these people have fought for freedoms, freedom of speech, freedom of expression.
I mean, I have to say what concerns me about this is why is this news? And it's interesting actually for me this morning.
That's what I think.
It's not on the front of any of the Scottish newspapers, not on any of them. It's on the front of every newspaper down here. The media have led a sustained campaign against this guy.
Yeah.
I want to make up my own mind about this person.
Yeah.
And
this is from Emily. She says, I have more respect for him not singing the national anthem. It would have been easy for him to bow to public pressure and sing, but to stand by something you believe in, even when it's unpopular, is a hard thing to do. And this is from Colette. He's well known for not supporting the monarchy. If he had sung the national anthem, he would have been in the news today for being hypocritical to his beliefs. He attended the ceremony and he stood there respectfully instead of playing up to the cameras like the others.
The previous story got a little bit of coverage. This got virtually none. The Canary says Jeremy Corbyn wins an award for world peace, and the silence from the mainstream media is deafening. Leave aside the fact he didn't get much coverage for his pretty well-received speech at the United Nations. It turns out that he also won something called the, let me get the name of it. Sean McBride Peace Prize. The response to this is, well, we never really cover this.
The motion brought before the House today by the government authorising military action in Syria against ISIL faces us with exactly that decision. The Prime Minister's attempt to brand those who plan to vote against the government as terrorist sympathisers both demeans the office of the Prime Minister and, I believe, undermines the seriousness of the deliberations we're having today. If the Prime Minister now wants to apologise for those remarks, I'd be happy to give way to him to do so. The attack in Douma was an horrific attack on civilians using chemical weapons, part of a civil war that has killed hundreds of thousands of people. Mr. Speaker, this statement serves as a reminder that the Prime Minister is accountable to this Parliament, not to the whims of the US President.
And out there, public opinion is broadly speaking on your side. You have a reputation for being a plain speaker on these subjects. Can you not just say, I'm against using missiles against Syria under all circumstances? It's always wrong.
I've made it very clear that the use of missiles anywhere has consequential effects. What is presented on media and is often fed in by defence departments all around the world is that it's all surgical, clean, all over. Well, unfortunately, the world isn't quite like that. Our exports that go to Saudi Arabia, for example, end up killing people in the Yemen. Okay.
Well, this is where you can really see the tragedy of Yemen. There's ward after ward here of severely malnourished children. In the bed across the way, doctors show us another 2-year-old called Bassem. Dr. Najla, who is trained in Liverpool, says only peace will save Yemen's children.
The final solution for our problem is to stop the war.
Our message to the international community and the European countries is to look at our situation.
But it looked awfully to me as though the Prime Minister was more interested in following Donald Trump's lead than anything else. And this is policy made up by Twitter.
Trump's first foreign trip was to Saudi Arabia last year, cultivating a close relationship with Saudi rulers. Trump is reluctant to end U.S. arms sales to Riyadh if allegations the Saudis murdered Khashoggi were to prove true.
They're spending $110 billion purchasing military equipment and other things. If we don't sell it to them, they'll say, well, thank you very much, we'll buy it from Russia, or thank you very much, we'll buy it from China. That doesn't help us, not when it comes to jobs and not when it comes to our companies losing out on that work.
If I were to stand here on this broadcast and tell you that a foreign power had bombed a school bus full of American children, there would be no bigger story. We would be in a state of panic, horror, and mourning, and almost certainly immediate war. In fact, the thought experiment doesn't even work, because if that had happened, you wouldn't need me to tell you about it at 8:45. You'd know minutes after it happened. Well, today, a foreign power did bomb a school bus full of children. Only it was Yemeni children, and the Saudi-led coalition that did that bombing is backed by us, by the United States. Our government, our public dollars are paying to kill Yemeni children, and it's our government and our representatives that can stop it.
Saudi Arabia is one of the most abhorrent regimes on the face of the earth. It exports an ideology which has helped radicalise extremists the world over, including ISIS. It beheads its own citizens, dissidents, gays, those deemed to be witches. It subjects women to some of the most barbaric oppression on the face of the earth. And the worst atrocity of all, the Saudi war in Yemen, which is armed and backed by Britain and the United States, with millions of people on the brink of what is being described as the biggest famine on earth for 100 years. And yet it is one of the strongest, most staunchest allies of the British and American government, who are culpable in every single crime that the Saudi dictatorship commits against its own citizens and citizens abroad.
The brutal bombardment of Yemen, pushing that country to the brink of famine, and now the state-sponsored murder of Jamal Khashoggi. What more evidence of criminality does the Prime Minister need before she fully commits to ending the sales of arms to the brutal regime in Saudi Arabia?
The procedures we follow are among the strictest in the world. A licence will not be issued to Saudi Arabia or any other destination if to do so would be inconsistent with any provision of the consolidated EU and national arms export licensing criteria.
The United Kingdom has its own strict rules about exports. And indeed there are consolidated rules applied across the whole of the European Union. We have a parliamentary committee which examines how those things are conducted. And we do so, everything that takes place, British exports take place within those rules.
Over the years, Saudi Arabia has been a strong ally of the United Kingdom of the West. Apart from Yemen, Saudi Arabia has not had a reputation of using its military in other countries. First time it's been accused of that kind of aggression. So this is a one-off so far.
What's been done here is truly shocking. This port serves 70 to 80% of the imports coming into Yemen, a country almost entirely dependent on imported food. There's no way you could possibly disable this port without knowing it would have a catastrophic effect on food supplies for ordinary civilians.
There is a suggestion that much of the bombing has been done by the Houthis themselves. Indeed, that the damage to the cranes at
they killed their own side,
may
did they?
have been an inside job. No, that may have been an inside job.
That is one of the most cynical accusations to level.
It's an accusation that is
out
out there.
a load of
I
chaff,
merely report
they might
what
be
is
killing
being
themselves.
said. No, they might be deliberately trying to tribute blame to the Saudis.
Despite it being considered the world's worst humanitarian crisis, a British charities found that almost half of people in the UK are unaware there's a war there at all, even though their country is the second biggest supplier of weapons to the country waging the bombing campaign there.
Half the UK don't know about most things happening internationally.
Not enough has been said about it.
It depends on what the media is emphasising at a particular point in time, which influences public knowledge and opinion.
At issue is whether the UK has done enough to satisfy itself that British weapons are not being used to commit war crimes. Privately, I've been told that government lawyers and indeed officials are very worried indeed about the possibility of a legal challenge.
The UK has a very clear legal regime, and that legal regime says that the UK won't provide licences for arms exports if there is a clear risk there may be violations of international humanitarian law.
The British government has confirmed that it's aware of the allegations that violations of international law are being committed on the ground in Yemen, and it is also aware that the assurances being given by the Saudi authorities are perhaps not watertight.
And yet the government has continued to grant export licences for arms sales to Saudi Arabia for use in Yemen.
And we're one of the principal donors bringing relief to those who are suffering.
UK arms export law is very clear. It says that if there's a chance that UK arms might be used in violations of international humanitarian law, then a sale shouldn't go ahead. Thousands of people have died, hospitals have been destroyed, schools have been destroyed, and I think a lot of people are outraged by the fact that UK arms are so central to this bombardment.
This quiet, softly spoken gentleman who has only ever talked about peace. As we remember the fallen, he said, let's truly honour the words never again. That's what he said yesterday. Slowly, this dignified, extraordinary politician of our time spoke. Humbly, we remembered the brave who left home, not knowing if they would see their loved ones again. And we remember the 2 world wars which destroyed a generation and shattered communities across the world. But the scourge of homelessness among veterans must end. Let today spur us into action to give veterans the security and support they deserve with a new social contract for veterans. It was 13,000 homeless veterans, 13,000 sleeping on streets with traumatic mental health, post-traumatic stress disorder. It's appalling. But let history record that on the 11th hour and the 11th day, the 11th month, 100 years after the end of the war, the right-wing media acknowledged this moment with anger as scruffy Corbyn lays wreath in an anorak. You're like, you what? In an anorak?
This cry is being delivered by at least 200 town criers across the world at this time. Oh yay! Oh yay! Oh yeah! Town criers, raise your voices together and cry with me, remembering those brave men and women in our history. The battle is over. A nation's tribute remembers them one and all. Be proud and stand united. Don't let your memories fall. Confidence is what we need so that nations trust each other and all the races of mankind treat each other as a brother. Food for every living thing by nature is provided. If we could only see it was equally divided. The woods and streams, the mountains high, the sea and the golden shore were never, ever meant to be the cause of bloody, senseless war. Or race for powerful armaments and sacrifice of youth, but a world of true contentment built on faith and trust and truth. Peace to the world. God save Her Majesty the Queen!